It began with one astounding question in year 2007, a question that would come to spark a change in an organization, but also global conversation on capitalism. And the question was, what should the right level of profit be? And it was asked by the family shareholders in Mars. I guess you know the company. They're known for their chocolate, but they're also one of the world's biggest producers of pet food. It's a company with 125,000 employees. And it was a very strange question, because normally we would think that shareholders, they think that the right level of profit is as much profit as possible. But it was a question that didn't really start in 2007. But it started, I think, somewhere in the 1960s when Forrest Mars, the then CEO of the company, wrote a manifesto that he called The Purpose of a Company. And in that manifesto, he outlined 5 principles, which we could call the values of the organization, where one of them was that we base decisions on mutuality of benefit to our stakeholders. So this question of what should the right level of profit be was really a question of how do we live our purpose and our values with integrity. And that's exactly what our purpose and our values should do. It should make us ask questions, hard questions, uncomfortable questions. And the board of Mars, they decided to ask their chief economist Bruno Roch to really go on an exploration of what is the right level of profit and what does it really mean for us to continually live out the principle of mutuality. And they did it together with an internal think tank called Catalyst, and in a joint project together, or joint process with Oxford University Said School of Business. And they worked out of a belief that if you only focus on maximizing one type of capital, which is the typical financial capital, you will miss social, human, and natural capital that is also essential to the growth of the business. If we only focus on financial profit, we will miss all the other parts of what it means to live out mutuality as a company. And they started doing a number of different case studies, and one was in Kenya, a project called MAWA, which was done in a part of the country where the financial level is really low, and the normal model of business for Mars of mass marketing and mass distribution didn't work in that area because it was low income and it was outside of the typical financial and distribution markets. So they decided to cooperate with NGOs, with churches, with community groups to find entrepreneurs that they could partner with and provide jobs for. And they looked at how they could develop skills and how they could build trust within the community, how they can not just focus on the financial aspect, but focus on how do we maximize all these other types of capital within the company. And it led to a very profitable business that became 15% of Wrigley, which is this company that is owned by Mars, 15% of their turnover. They also tested the principle of mutuality in Royal Canin, which is one of the companies that Mars owns. And they wanted to invest in social and human capital. And through conversations with dog breeders and veterinarians, they found that 1 in 5 puppies die after just 2 weeks, and that there was a lack of research in puppy mortality. And this led them to launch a 5-year study. And through that study, they found that, or they created a groundbreaking product that could help decrease the mortality in puppies. And if you would have looked at that from a normal kind of capitalism view, or a normal market capitalism, you wouldn't have gone into something like that, because it was very costly, and it was a quite narrow product, and it wasn't very profitable. But the company has had incredible growth over the last years, and as they've looked into the reasons for that, they found that the reasons are that they've lived out the principle of mutuality, and that actually if you focus not just on maximizing financial capital, but if you focus on maximizing the other capitals, you will actually have a more profitable business. And Mars realized as well that if they really want to see this mutuality lived out in their company and also outside of their company, they have to persuade suppliers and competitors and governments that systemic change is needed. So they did that by launching an organization called the Economics of Mutuality that is working over the world to spread this message and to help provide principles and guidelines of how you can incorporate this in your organization. As one professor at Oxford says, the economics of mutuality is a groundbreaking concept of management that will have profound influence on business practice, education, and research over the coming decades. So I took this example of Mars because I think it's one of the great examples of what it looks like when values and purpose are lived out with integrity in an organization. And we see these examples, for example, in the Swedish car company Volvo, where the principle of safety has been so much a part of their culture, so much a part of how they have operated as a company, that it has led to innovation and it has led to prioritizing safety in the way that they manufacture their cars. We see it in a company like Southwest Airlines that are known for their customer service, where the principle of having a servant's heart is something that they really prioritize when they recruit and when they train their people. And even though they compete with much more premium air travel companies, they are still known for this incredible customer service. And we see it in the Swedish company IKEA, that has the purpose to create a better everyday life for the many people. And where that is lived out in the principle of cost effectiveness and cost consciousness, where they would say that at IKEA, a furniture without a price tag has no value, because that's how they live out that purpose and that principle, and it's something that really permeates the culture of the company. But we often, unfortunately, see the opposite. I've looked at many of the high-profile scandals and researched, and if, for example, we see some of the examples here of Swedbank, the money laundering scandal. We see Wells Fargo, where thousands of employees were opening accounts and even credit cards for people who haven't asked for them. We see it in TeliaSonera, where they had a big corruption scandal, or in Uber, where there was really a cultural issue that created a very unhealthy workplace a number of years ago. And maybe even more common than these big scandals are just organizations where these purpose and value statements seem to mean very little. And the consequences of that are that they will mask vitally important issues. These values and purpose statements will mask vitally important issues and concerns that the organization really should be addressing. And that they will create a dissonance that will hurt internal trust in the organization. And that these statements, even though the organization might pride themselves of them, they will not create or offer any direction for the company. So to look at how you as a leader, how you as maybe an HR compliance professional can actually contribute to a culture of purpose and integrity, I want to look at 4 different practices that I believe that you need to make sure to internalize in your organization. Number 1 is to create uncomfortable clarity. And number 2 is to welcome brokenness. And number 3 is to empower dissenting voices. And number 4 is to fight for uncompromising integrity. So we'll start with practice number 1, create uncomfortable clarity. When Mars developed this economics of mutuality, the main motivation was to measure how to live out their purpose and values with integrity. And as a part of that, they are developing a new system of accounting where they will be measured not just on their financial results, but also in how well they actually maximize social and human capital and so on. And the thing with clarity is that it can really be uncomfortable because it removes the ambiguity around whether we live our purpose and values or not. And that's why I think many organizations, and maybe that is true in your organization, why we choose ambiguity over clarity. Because we don't really want to know, or we don't really want to be challenged based on our values and our purpose. And as I teach and as I coach on purpose and values and cultures to leaders in lots of different types of organizations, I see over and over again that the reality of these statements are often, number one, that leaders and employees do not know their values, and that the values can be interpreted in 100 different ways, and that the values are not founded on an analysis of the corporate culture, and that the values have no real connection to the realities of the business, and that the values are aspirational desires. They are not actually lived in the organization today. And the values are owned by an HR function, and they're not lived out by the leadership. And the company views the values as inspirational statements and tries to avoid any talk about tensions and dilemmas. I had the opportunity to interview Mikael Ahlberg, who came into TeliaSonera after their corruption scandal to build up the ethics and compliance function. And she said like this, that many companies assume that they have a wonderful culture, but they have never really made an assessment to see what kind of company they are. It's so easy for us to assume that we have an ethical or we have a great culture, but many times we haven't really taken the time to understand what kind of company are we and what does our culture really look like. So before we go further into this, I want us to just talk about the definition of purpose and values. So purpose, your purpose answers why your company exists on the most fundamental level. And your purpose should not really be about you or your company, but about how it can be of service to your stakeholders. And I would say that the truth for most companies is actually that their purpose is to make as much profit as possible for their shareholders, because the other statements that they might have created or developed have not in any fundamental level challenged the purpose of how their company really operates. And that is something that you have to do if you really want to live out from a sense of purpose with integrity. And then we look at values. So true core values are not inspirational words. The values are the principles that you are not willing to compromise with, even when it costs you, whether that's short-term profit, whether that's prestige, or maybe your position, or maybe that is that it makes it hard to recruit people if you live by your values. I used to say like this, that values that are not allowed to cost anything are not worth anything either. So values should help you ask the right and the hard questions about how you operate. And there's a danger here, and it's the danger of wrong motivation. That so often when we go into working with values and purpose statements in our company, we do it from an external perspective or to look better. So I would say that never let your work on values or purpose be driven primarily from a marketing or employer branding perspective, because it will make you focus on appearance and you will lose your integrity. It will make you focus on how other people see you. It will make you focus on your aspirations instead of being true to what your company really is. So there are three things that are super important for us to have uncomfortable clarity on. Number one is who you will recruit, because who you bring in to become a part of your team and your company will really shape the culture and the values of your company. And the second is what you will reward, because the things that we celebrate in an organization, the things that we promote, the things that we speak highly of, they will multiply throughout the organization. And the third one is what you will accept, because the things that we tolerate, even the things that are in conflict with our values, but we still choose to tolerate them, they will spread in the organization and they can really become like a cancer and lead to a very unhealthy culture in the organization. So I want you to just ask yourself that question in your organization. Who will we recruit, and who will we reward, and what will we not accept, and is that truly in line with the values that we say that we have and the purpose that we say that we should live? So practice number 2 is to welcome brokenness. Dr. Leonard Wong, a research professor at the US Army War College, he was asked by the Chief of Staff of the Army to research why junior officers weren't innovative or creative thinkers or independent thinkers enough. So he traveled around the world with a task force, and he found that the Army had created so many demands and so many requirements on junior leaders that they basically spent all their times doing things that other people had told them to do. And one of the areas where they saw this issue was in the area of mandatory training, where they would have 256 available training days, but they had 297 days of required training. So very obviously there was no time for independent thinking. So Lenny, he ended this study, but he left it with this question on the back of his mind. If the Army requires more from officers that they can literally physically accomplish, then what are they reporting? And Lenny knew the answer to that, because you have to report like every month, or they would have to sit down at the computer and put in what mandatory trainings they had gone through. And you have to report that you've done everything. Otherwise, you cannot be in the Army. So the answer to the question was that they were not telling the truth. So Lenny went to his research partner Stephen Garris, and he said to him that, I know what we are supposed to research next. We should look at how we lie within the Army profession. And Stephen sat at his computer typing on something, and he said, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't lie. And Lenny said, yes, we lie. There's so many things that we have to do. There's so many required things, and we can't do them all. And then Stephen became a bit angry, and he said back, but I never lie. You can just ask my wife. She knows that I would never lie. But Lenny pressed on and asked him, so what are you doing, as Stephen was typing away on his computer? And Stephen said, I'm just putting in all the mandatory trainings that we have to get done. And then Lenny said, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. We haven't done all of them. We're lying. And as they kept on researching and looking into this, they found that this was something that was seen in so many different areas of the Army. For example, every quarter, officers should do a quarterly evaluation together with their subordinates. But many times they might be in different parts of the world, and they just couldn't get the time. So these evaluations didn't happen. But then every quarter, the officer would still sit at his computer, or his or her computer, and they would just have to type in that this evaluation has been done. And they would basically choose an arbitrary date, just trying to make sure that it would not be on a weekend, and they would put that into the system. And of course, these things might seem like trivial issues that do not have maybe that big of a effect on the organization. But Lenny and Stephen found that this creates a moral numbness and a slippery slope. It creates a culture of dishonesty. And one example how they saw how this could become really consequential was when they interviewed an officer who had been put to inspect 150 polling sites in Iraq to make sure that people could come and vote in a safe way. And he said that it was physically impossible to actually get that done. But he had received a spreadsheet from his leaders, and he said, I just gave them what they wanted. So he lied. And as they published this study, the reactions varied. At junior levels, people would say, I mean, this is nothing new. We see this every day. But at senior levels, there was a tendency to think, I mean, well, we don't really want to talk about this. And Lenny says that we don't want to say that we accept less than perfect values, and yet we have to balance that with, as individuals, as humans, we're not perfect. And as I've been looking into, and as I've been researching organizations that have gone through scandals, and actually also interviewed and also advised some of them, I've seen that there is this assumption that might be one of the most dangerous things that we can have in our culture. And that's the assumption of a good organization. That a strongly held assumption that we're a good or ethical organization with great values is one of the most dangerous culture traits, because it makes us blind to issues in our culture and organizational design, and it can lead us to attack anyone who brings them to our attention because we desperately want to keep up appearances. I have had the opportunity to interview a number of ethics professors, and I talked to Anton Brunsell, who's the author of Blind Spots and who has done a lot of research on how and why we think that we are more ethical than we actually are. And she says that while we exhibit positive illusions about a variety of traits, we almost exhibit hyper illusions about our own ethicality. And one example of what that can lead to in an organization was in the Swedish customs office, where there were allegations of racist behavior. There was a man who felt he had been treated in a racist way, and this is now a court case and it's words against words. We don't know what really happened. But one journalist at a leading Swedish newspaper, he interviewed the leadership of the customs office, or one high official in the leadership, and asked her if this could have happened within the organization. And she answered that we train our staff to have an objective view of the people we investigate. We have core values as a government organization that clearly state that you must be responsible and objective. We also have our own set of core values which state that our staff has to treat people in a professional way. Objectivity and everyone's equal values are guidelines for our entire operation. And the journalist asked her, so does that mean that you can't do anything wrong? And she said, yes, it means that we can't do anything wrong. And while this may sound absurd, I see this over and over in organizations as we talk about our purpose and our value statements. A typical thing might be like this, that we might say that these values are our compass and they guide all the behaviors in our organization and they permeate our culture. While at the same time, that might not at all be true. And it creates an illusion. And it creates a dangerous illusion that we think that we actually live things that we do not live. So instead of assuming that we are a good and ethical organization, we need to take a courageously humble approach, and we need to listen and dare to ask dangerous questions. We need to get the things up up over the surface. And our leaders need to be willing to admit to dissonance and to own their part. And we need to address the dissonance head on. When we see that dissonance between the values we say we should live by, between the purpose that we say that we should live out, and how we actually operate, we need to deal with it and we need to address it. And I've seen in organizations that we've worked with that where they have gone through a scandal and where there have been a real lack of trust within the organization, when the leadership have been ready to actually admit to it, to acknowledge it, and actually take responsibility for it, and talk about it to their team in a very transparent and vulnerable way, it has led to trust being rebuilt. And it has led to that kind of big just dissonance that everyone in the organization felt has been able to be healed. So practice number 3 is that we need to empower dissenting voices. Darden Business School professor Mary Gentile was at a self-defense class at Harvard Business School when she realized something. She really had an aha moment that would come to impact her career. And she had been developing the first mandatory ethics curriculum at Harvard Business School, and she had then gone on to do similar things at other leading business schools and universities around the US. But then came the Enron scandal and a number of other high-profile business scandals. And some of these people that have gone through these educations and through these ethics trainings were now on the front pages of the newspapers because of unethical behavior. And Mary told me that she had kind of a crisis of faith, where she realized that the way, and as they looked more into the research, they saw that the way that ethics is normally being taught is a focus on looking at different hypothetical dilemmas. And then you should take different philosophical theories and look at which one should I apply to this situation and try to decide what is the right thing to do. And I think the same is true many times of values in our organization, that's how we look at our values. And that, okay, we look at, okay, so now we should think what is the right thing to do in different situations. But what you realized is that when people know what the right thing to do is, they don't know how to speak up. So instead of speaking up, they become paralyzed. And they just find a lot of reasons not to actually bring it to their leaders or to their peers' attention. So when she was at that self-defense class, she realized that just as in self-defense or in other types of sports, how you might train up a muscle memory so that we can do something almost without thinking. For example, if you would be attacked, that you could react with a certain grip almost without thinking. In the same way, we need to train up a moral muscle memory. Knowing what is right, we need to know how to express that. So for our values and purpose to be lived with integrity, we need to empower dissenting voices and train our people to give voice to their values, to bring up conflicts between our purpose and values and the way we operate as leaders and organizations, instead of suppressing it. And I would say that for many organizations, we pride ourselves of that we don't have many of these issues reported, but instead we should pride ourselves of being able to bring them up to the surface. And one example of that was Rob Chestnut at Airbnb. He was the chief ethics officer at Airbnb. And they really wanted to work and make sure that they would build intentional integrity into the culture of the company. And one of the things that they did was that they instituted something called ethics advisors. It was a group of people in different leadership positions that would be trained for employees or other leaders to come to them and talk about values, conflicts, or dilemmas that they saw in the organization, and just get advice on what would be the best way to actually bring this up. That these employees wouldn't have to become whistleblowers or go to HR, but that it would be just a very simple, informal way to have these conversations. And what they saw was that it led to so many more of these conversations actually starting to come up within the organization. I love something that Ron Carucci told me. He's a coach to CEOs at some of the world's biggest companies and has written a book called To Be Honest. And he said, he asked the question, how many people in the last week have come into your office and said something to you that was uncomfortable to hear about your leadership, about your department and team? Because here's what's factual, he says, that if on a regular basis there are not people coming into your office telling you things that are difficult for you to hear, you can be very confident that your leadership sucks, because the absence of that data is loud data. So some keys to empowering these voices in our organizations are then to train our employees and leaders to speak up and to create a safe way for them to do so. That honesty should not be equated with courage, really, but it should be the most normal thing in our organizations, that we are honest and we know how to speak honestly. And that we train our leaders to listen and respond in a way that encourages the conversation, that doesn't make people feel afraid. I've seen so many times in organizations where a leader will say, oh, my door is always open. But at the same time, when I would ask around in the organization, I learned that the people that have brought up concerns have felt very clearly that this is not something that we appreciate in this organization. And to see that the mission of our purpose and values is not merely to inspire us, but to spark an inner wrestle about what we shouldn't compromise about. So I want you to ask yourself these questions in your organization. How empowered are dissenting voices? Do people feel safe to bring up values and purpose dilemmas and conflicts? Do you regularly have people bring up these dilemmas to you as a leader? And are leaders in your organization trained to respond well when someone brings dilemmas to your attention? So now we're going to go into the last practice, which is practice number 4, fight for uncompromising integrity. And I chose the word fight for because integrity is not just something that we just have, but it is something that we continually have to work actively to protect and maintain in our organizations. We have to make sure that our strategy, that our structures and processes, that our leadership, that our culture, that our budget, that all these different aspects of our organization are actually aligned with our purpose and values. And there are a number of questions that I think are important for us to ask ourselves. For example, what does how we plan and spend the time of our team tell us about what we value? And what does how we budget and spend tell us about what we value? And what does the way we relate to each other internally and to our clients tell us about what we value? And what do the people we recruit tell us about what we value? And what do the behaviors we celebrate and promote tell us about what we value? And what do the destructive behaviors that we accept tell us about what we value? And what do the things we design our organizations to hinder or to make happen tell us about what we value? And what does our internal and external communication tell us about what we value? The truth about what we value will be seen in all these different aspects of how we operate as an organization. So to say that our values are certain statements might not at all be true if that is not shown in all these priorities. And one very important thing is that we cannot make exceptions for high performers or senior leaders if we want to fight for integrity. We have to make sure that and Anna Romberg, who also worked with Tobias Sturesson to incorporate this ethics function, she said that you need to look in an organization and see if you kind of push up the compliance and the values up through the organization, where do you start to make exceptions? And she said that at Telia we saw that we put all these kind of principles in place of who we should do business with and so on, but there was at a certain level in the company where suddenly exceptions started to be made. And we have to make sure that our integrity runs from the front line, from the people on the front line to the people, to the CEO and the leadership team and the board. So I will end with just repeating these 4 practices. Number 1 is to create uncomfortable clarity. Number 2 is to welcome brokenness. And number 3 is that we empower dissenting voices. And number 4 is that we fight for uncompromising integrity. And I would say that as we work on creating and building a culture of purpose and integrity, it's not complicated, but at the same time, it's not easy because it requires us to be intentional and to be consistent, that we keep on doing the right things, that we keep on making sure that we listen to the voices, that we keep on making sure that we actually fight for integrity. And while there is a price to pay, there's also a really great reward. Because what I've seen is that if we want to build organizations that can stay successful in the long haul, that will have a positive impact on the world, we need to build that culture of purpose and integrity. So thank you so much for for watching this. Thank you so much for taking these thoughts to heart. And Heart Management, which I'm the co-founder of, is a company that educates and coaches and inspires leaders to succeed in their work on values, culture, and change. And one of the things we do is that we have a podcast called Leading Transformational Change. And if you go and subscribe to that podcast, you will hear interviews with leading researchers and leaders that can really help you think about these issues in a deeper way. And you can also go to our website, heartmanagement.org, and just download material that can help you on this journey. And feel very welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. So thank you so much. And I really hope that this message will help you to build that culture, purpose, and integrity in your organization.